In the early morning of October 7, 2023, Hamas launched the largest ever terrorist attack on Israeli soil. It broke through Israeli defenses at several places along the Israel-Gaza border, killing 1,189 people, including 815 civilians, wounding 7,500 and taking 251 hostage. Israel's response was swift and massive, but it went on for more than a year and a half, creating a humanitarian catastrophe along the way. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at the October 7 attack by Hamas and the subsequent Israel-Hamas war. At 6:29 a.m. on Saturday, October 7, 2023, Hamas unleashed a barrage of rockets and mortar shells on Israeli towns and military bases. This was the start of Operation Al-Aqsa Deluge, which was a reference to the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem. But this was just the opening salvo in the deadliest terrorist attack on Israel since its birth in 1948. And with this barrage of rockets and mortar shells, Israel's air defense system, Iron Dome, which was deployed in 2011, was rapidly overwhelmed. Per Israeli military, about 2,500 rockets were fired by Hamas in a 20-minute initial barrage, sending them up to 80 kilometers into Israeli territory. So what is the Iron Dome air defense system? Israel has 4 tiers of air defense systems to block any missile and drone attacks from its enemies. The outer layers are the Arrow 2 and Arrow 3 systems, which are designed to intercept ballistic missiles fired from thousands of kilometers away. The third layer is called David's Sling and provides the middle layer of protection and is meant to engage shorter range ballistic missiles launched from 100 to 200 kilometers away. And the final ring of protection comes from the best known and most used Israel's air defense system, the short-range Iron Dome. And this is optimized for destroying small, slow, unguided targets such as short-range rockets and drones. So how does the Iron Dome work? Well, the Iron Dome comprises 3 key components which are collectively called the battery. And these 3 components of the battery are the radar, which detects incoming targets within a 100-kilometer radius and provides mid-course guidance for the TAM-Air interceptor missile. The second component is the Battery Management Control System, or BMC, which calculates the impact point of an incoming missile and only intercepts those that will fall in a protected area. And the third, the key component of the air defense, is the TAM-Air interceptor missile launcher, which can fire up to 20 interceptor missiles at a time against incoming missiles. Overall, there are 4 TAM-Air interceptor missile launchers across Israel to protect the civilian population. And the key element in Israel's air defense Iron Dome is the efficient and cost-effective way in which it operates. The whole purpose of the BMC component is to identify the projectiles that are likely to impact a civilian area and ignore the ones that will likely land in a safe place. And this alone drastically reduces the load on the interceptor missile launcher. But on that morning of October 7, 2023, since this entire system was heavily overloaded and Israel's defense infrastructure was focused on managing this incoming barrage of rockets, it was the perfect cover for Hamas fighters to breach the 59-kilometer barrier separating the Gaza Strip from Israel. Along the Gaza border, numerous Israeli watchtowers topped with machine guns were neutralized using drones armed with explosives. Post that, the cameras placed along the border and the telecommunication infrastructure was destroyed. And any military equipment placed along the border, including armored vehicles, were also targeted and destroyed. Once the military defenses were disabled explosives were used to create dozens of breaches in the security fences. And at this point, with Israeli defense along the Gaza border being completely breached, Hamas fighters on motorbikes and pickup trucks infiltrated the Israeli territory before bulldozers widened the gaps in the fences to allow larger vehicles to pass through. So within a 30-minute range, most of the intended targets were hit and Hamas was inside Israeli territory. Once inside Israeli territory, Israeli military bases were targeted. At 10 a.m., the Israeli army acknowledged that armed Palestinians had entered 3 military sites. These bases were attacked with grenades, rocket launchers, and automatic weapons, and Israeli soldiers did not regain control of these bases until the end of the day. Now, once the border was breached, between 2,000 and 3,000 Palestinians, including Hamas fighters, members of other Palestinian factions, and Palestinian civilians, had crossed into Israeli territory. And while a few of these groups were attacking the Israeli military bases, a lot of them were out in the streets, ransacking small towns and indiscriminately killing people in the streets. The largest massacre of civilians, though, took place at the Supernova Music Festival near the town of Reem, where about 3,000 people had gathered. And as the festival goers started running towards their cars to drive home, a whole batch of Hamas commandos dropped from the air and started firing indiscriminately at the crowd, killing 364 people, which amounted to half of the civilian casualties on October 7. Wow, what a planned and coordinated attack. And the Israeli intelligence had no wind of it? That question has been up for debate for a while now. Was Israeli intelligence aware and the leadership just ignored it? Or were they completely clueless? The answer seems to be somewhere in the middle. The Hamas were able to evade Israeli intelligence. How? Through a network of hardwired phones built into a network of tunnels underneath Gaza. In short, the Hamas was able to avoid the high-tech Israeli intelligence infrastructure by using a completely low-tech infrastructure. Though Iran supposedly did not have any role in the October 7 attack itself, it did help Hamas develop their operational security tactics over the years. Israel was aware of the existence of the underground tunnels and the hardwired phones, but it had been unable to break through into this network, the network of underground tunnels that it had nicknamed Gaza Metro. And this vast labyrinth of tunnels were used to transport people and goods, store rockets and ammunition, and house Hamas's command and control centers. So while the planning and strategizing for the October 7 attack was mostly obscured from Israeli intelligence, the actual exercises and training to prepare for the attack were conducted in broad daylight. In fact, starting 2020, 4 joint drills were held over 3 years with various Palestinian armed factions, and these were documented and published on social media channels. And these exercises were reported on in Israel, so it is not possible that the Israeli intelligence was totally unaware. And weeks before the attacks, Israeli surveillance soldiers near the Gaza border reportedly warned of unusually high drone activity and that Hamas was training to take over observation posts with replicas of their positions. And the standard response provided by Israeli intelligence and Israeli defense forces is that they were aware of this training going on, but they did not know what they were training for. So it appears that the Israeli intelligence was looking at the information being delivered to them on a platter instead of piecing it together and coming to a conclusion. Now back to October the 7th. Shortly before 10 a.m., Israel started its response and began retaliatory airstrikes on Gaza Strip. At 11:34 a.m., Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the nation and announced, "Citizens of Israel, we are at war, not in an operation or in rounds, but at war." This morning, Hamas launched a murderous surprise attack against the state of Israel and its citizens. We've been in this since the early morning hours. The Prime Minister further announced that Hamas would pay an unprecedented price and that Israel would win. And shortly thereafter, Israeli army called up 360,000 reservists to reinforce its army of 170,000 soldiers. Now, as these attacks were unfolding, Hamas started broadcasting several propaganda videos glorifying the attacks and its fighters. And these videos depicted gruesome savagery: summary execution of civilians, hostage taking, grenades thrown into houses, corpses brought back to the Gaza Strip. Several shocking scenes were broadcast through the course of the day. A few months after the attack, the UN confirmed that it had found clear and convincing information that sexual violence, including rape, sexualized torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment, had been committed against Israeli hostages. Starting midday, October 7, Israeli security forces were finally deployed to recapture the military bases and the police stations. Hamas continued to fire new rocket barrages into Israeli cities while the Israeli forces were busy recapturing the towns and military bases. 3 days later, on October 10, the Israeli army finally declared that it had regained control of all the areas infiltrated by Hamas. So how was Hamas able to get the funds to finance its network and militants? The short answer: Israel. Yes, you heard it right. Israel. As early as December 2012, Benjamin Netanyahu told a prominent Israeli journalist that it was important to keep Hamas strong as a counterweight to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. Netanyahu felt that having two strong rivals on opposite ends would lessen pressure on him to negotiate towards a Palestinian state. And during this period, Qatar became a key financier for reconstruction and government operations in Gaza. Qatar, which is one of the world's wealthiest nations, has championed the Palestinian cause, and over a period of time, it was able to cultivate close ties to Hamas. And that is the primary reason why Qatari officials have been able to help negotiate the release of Israeli hostages in Gaza in recent times. Wait, and Israel was okay with this? Okay, it supported it. The logic provided was that Hamas should be strong enough to rule Gaza, but weak enough to be deterred by Israel. In 2017, Republicans in Congress pushed to impose financial sanctions on Qatar over its support for Hamas. And Benjamin Netanyahu lobbied Washington on Qatar's behalf. He dispatched senior defense officials to Washington who told the American lawmakers that Qatar played a positive role in the Gaza Strip, so imposing sanctions on Qatar would not be the right move. So we now understand the financing of this operation and the secrecy that made it successful. But how was the plan executed? The whole plan was so secret that even those in the front line who marched into Israeli territory and fought the various battles were not aware of it till very close to the actual start of the attacks. Around 4 a.m., the first orders went out, mainly by word of mouth, to bring your weapons and any ammunition you have and assemble at the specific landmarks. Now remember, a lot of exercises had been conducted by Hamas, so the weapons had already been issued to the identified fighters. So even when the instructions were issued to collect at the various points, nobody knew what was going to happen. And these instructions were not just communicated randomly. They were cascaded, given first to the commanders of the battalions, then to the leaders of the platoons, who told the squad commanders, who cascaded the message down to the fighters who had joined in the regular drills held in dozens of locations across Gaza. And at this point, when everybody had assembled, extra ammunition and more powerful weaponry was distributed. So now, the Hamas fighters carried handheld and rocket-propelled grenades, heavy machine guns, sniper rifles, and explosives. At 6 a.m., once the sun was up, the final orders were issued, and these were written down. The assembled men were to rush through gaps that would soon be blown or smashed through the perimeter fence around Gaza. And once they were through, they were to attack Israeli soldiers and civilians on the other side. There were two primary masterminds behind this attack. Yahya Sinwar, the overall head of Hamas in Gaza, and Mohammed Daif, the commander of Hamas's military Al-Qassam brigades and Nukba squads. Once again, the written notes were not random. Each unit was given a specific objective devised by Sinwar and Daif. So some units' objective was a military base, or a road, or a town, and these orders were accompanied by maps showing details of the defenses and key locations within their targets. Overall, there were three categories of tasks that were assigned to the Hamas militants. So while the barrage of rockets created the necessary distraction, the first group was ordered to overwhelm the undermanned and unprepared Israeli military bases around Gaza and attack civilians in their homes. The second group was ordered to defend positions against Israeli military forces when they showed up, and this was to be accomplished via ambushes on key roads. And the third group was instructed to seize as many hostages as possible and bring them through the gaps in the fences where dedicated squads were waiting to take the hostages into the vast tunnels under Gaza. And it was this group that took more than 240 people hostage, including infants, children, elderly people, and military personnel. The secrecy around this operation was so high that even Hamas's political leadership overseas was not made aware of any details of the operation, nor were Hamas's sponsors in Iran. Coincidentally, Yahya Sinwar, a founding member of Hamas, spent 23 years in Israeli jails for killing Israeli soldiers. He was released among more than 1,000 prisoners in a 2011 swap for an Israeli soldier captured by Hamas. And this experience taught him that capturing Israeli soldiers was the only way to free prisoners. So what was Hamas's objective of the October 7 attacks? Some experts believed that it was to halt Israel's efforts to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia. But Hamas is mostly a militant organization, and strategic gameplay is not part of its repertoire. The more plausible reason came from a Hamas leader himself, who claimed that it had been a preemptive strike launched after the organization learned that Israeli forces were preparing a major assault on Gaza. But Hamas itself was surprised by its success. The slow response from Israeli forces enabled it to make multiple trips into Israel from Gaza and bring back more hostages. Some civilians too crossed into Israel and took captives, and this ultimately complicated the rescue and negotiation efforts. And it is absolutely clear that Hamas did not intend to capture and hold territory. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. On September 6, 1976, Lieutenant Viktor Belenko committed the most daring defection in espionage history. What did he do? Lieutenant Belenko flew his MiG-25P fighter to Hakodate Airport in the Hokkaido province of Japan. Defecting with the latest Soviet military hardware, along with classified technical manuals, is often considered one of the most daring defections in the Cold War era. So the answer is A, landed in Japan in a MiG-25P fighter jet. Question for the current episode. Israel's David's Sling missile defense system provides the middle layer of protection against shorter-range ballistic missiles launched in the 100 to 200 kilometer range. It has been developed and manufactured by Israel's Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and a US defense manufacturer. Who is the US defense manufacturer? Is it A, Lockheed Martin, B, Raytheon, C, Boeing, or D, Northrop Grumman? Once again, which US defense manufacturer has helped Israel build its shorter-range ballistic missile defense system? Is it A, Lockheed Martin, B, Raytheon, C, Boeing, or D, Northrop Grumman? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, we follow up on the October 7 attacks and look at the Israel-Gaza conflict, the initial days, the expansion of the scope of the conflict, and how it led to a human catastrophe. Till then, stay safe, but keep exploring the why in history.